If your company's CEO behaved the way Donald Trump treats the American economy, you wouldn't wait for the next quarterly report. You'd run, because a business can survive bad news, but it cannot survive a leader who improvises with the legal system and calls it strategy. Yet somehow when this happens in the White House, people convince themselves it's harmless, that politics is noise, that markets don't care. I've watched markets longer than some presidents have been alive, and I can tell you, markets care about one thing above all: predictable rules. Last week, a federal court blocked Trump's latest executive push, maneuver his team projected would generate $280 billion in new tariff-driven national revenue and redistribute $35 billion back to households in politically branded rebate checks. It sounded like a payday. It looked, in any financial model, like a fiscal hallucination. When judges reviewed the plan, they discovered that the administration had stitched it together using a rarely invoked 1984 emergency statute meant for supply chain sabotage, not for rewriting tax policy. The ruling was blunt. The president had exceeded statutory authority by a magnitude inconsistent with constitutional limits. The reaction in the markets was instant. The 10-year Treasury yield jumped 0.67% in 48 hours, a move that normally takes a month. The 5-year yield surged 0.55%, the steepest two-day rise since the post-9/11 bond shock. Mortgage rates, which had been drifting downward, shot from 6.21% to 7.04% before the weekend. For an average family buying a $400,000 home, that's $268 more every month, or $3,216 a year. The price of one presidential stunt dressed as economic policy. But the damage didn't stop with households. It never does. The jump in yields forced the Treasury to reprice its latest bond auction. The government will now pay an estimated $14.8 billion more in annual interest. Over 10 years, that's $170 billion in burn money that could have gone to infrastructure, Medicare, or actually useful tax relief. Let me show you what this looks like in real life, not theory. A retired couple in Colorado, Mark and Linda Peters, ages 71 and 69, held a $720,000 portfolio divided between income funds and municipal bonds. After the ruling, their portfolio dropped $31,900 in 4 days. Linda told their financial planner, "I thought courts blocking illegal policy was a good thing. Why did we lose a year of savings in 1 week?" Because when trust evaporates, volatility takes its place. And volatility eats retirement faster than inflation ever will. A small manufacturer in Ohio, Riverside Steelworks, relies on a revolving credit facility of $3.8 million to fund inventory. Their interest rate jumped from 6.2% to 7.1% overnight. Their CFO estimated the new cost $34,000 in additional interest per quarter. Hiring plans for 6 welders suspended. A city in Missouri planned to issue $52 million in municipal bonds to upgrade 3 aging water plants. Before the ruling, 3.44% interest, after 4.38%. That difference means taxpayers will lose $12.6 million in added interest over 20 years. Pipes will still break, bills will still rise, but the political tariff dividend won't exist because it was never real. Let me give you a cinematic image, because numbers alone don't capture the gravity. Picture a long table covered with thousands of small glass marbles. Each marble is a household budget. Each marble is a business loan. Each marble is a city's bond issue. Then picture someone shaking the table, not enough to topple it, but enough to loosen everything built on top. One political shock can rattle every marble on that table. And every marble that moves costs someone money. And here's the part almost nobody sees. The Federal Reserve had planned 2 rate cuts over the next 12 months, assuming fiscal policy would stabilize. After the court block, Fed models had to be rewritten. The projected rate cut path fell from 2 cuts to 0, and the probability of a rate hike jumped from 9% to 37% in internal modeling. When the Fed hesitates, it is not because they dislike Trump. It's because they hate being forced to guess what policy will survive the courts next month. Markets don't collapse from chaos. They sag under the weight of uncertainty. And uncertainty is exactly what Trump manufactures when he bypasses laws, improvises policy, and then calls the courts obstacles instead of guardrails. This didn't hurt elites. It hurt retirees, first-time homebuyers, small businesses, local governments, the backbone of compounding prosperity. This is why I keep telling people, you can't build long-term wealth on short-term improvisation. Not in a business, not in a country. And right now, the cost of improvisation is showing up line by line, portfolio by portfolio, household by household. When markets lose faith in predictability, they don't scream, they don't panic, they quietly reallocate. And that is far more dangerous because reallocations reshape economies long before the public understands what happened. 3 days after Trump's executive maneuver was blocked, foreign capital flows showed the first cracks.
The Treasury Department's internal tracking data that rarely makes headlines recorded a 19% drop in foreign demand for new 10-year bonds.
That number doesn't topple the system, but it whispers something the public doesn't like to hear. The world is hesitating. And in Tokyo, during a strategy briefing at Kawasaki Life Asset Management, a senior Japanese analyst said, "We are adjusting our 2025-2026 allocation model. The political premium in U.S. debt is no longer zero." That is one of the most damning sentences a creditor can say about a superpower. Japan alone holds more than 1.07 trillion USD in U.S. bonds. If even a sliver of that reconsiders its pace, yields rise for everyone. Meanwhile, in Frankfurt, analysts at a major German pension consortium downgraded their U.S. exposure rating from stable to revision watch. That shift pulled 4.3 billion USD out of U.S. municipal bonds within 72 hours. This isn't ideological. This is math reacting to legal chaos. Inside the U.S., companies began recalculating their risk models. Here are the numbers. Corporate America will never put on a campaign sign. 38% of mid-sized firms delayed capital expenditure plans in the 7 days after the ruling. 22% canceled scheduled hiring rounds for Q3. 41% raised internal risk premiums for projects dependent on federal permits. 17% increased their cash reserves, anticipating policy whiplash. These may sound like small percentages. They aren't. They are the early stages of a productivity recession, the kind you don't feel until it has already cost you years of future growth. Take the case of Red Oak Systems, a mid-sized robotics manufacturer in Texas. They planned a $8 million expansion to build industrial warehouse robots. After the bond market spike and Fed hesitation, their financing costs rose $1.1 million per year. Their CEO said something brutally honest. "One president's legal improvisation just added more to my borrowing cost than 3 years of inflation did." Multiply that by thousands of firms, and you understand why economies slow down even without an official recession. Now let's talk energy, where policy uncertainty costs more than any barrel of oil ever will. A fictional but realistic example. Blackstone Ridge Pipeline, a $14.2 billion multi-state infrastructure project, halted construction for 93 days to reassess regulatory vulnerability after Trump's blocked maneuver. That pause cost $312 million in contractor penalties, $47 million in storage and reassignment fees, 15,000 temporary layoffs across 3 states. And remember, this happened because of a different policy. Investors weren't reacting to pipelines, they were reacting to unpredictability. Or look at renewable energy. SolarGrid, a national solar developer, froze all new hiring after the ruling. Their CTO said, "We don't know which federal guideline will survive the next court ruling. We're not expanding into a fog." Fog is the enemy of investment, not storms. Fog. Let's move to consumers, the people who always pay the first and last bill.
Credit card APRs at major banks rose an average of 0.38% after the bond market repricing.
That means an American carrying $6,000 in revolving credit will pay an extra $174 a year for nothing. No new product, no new service, just the cost of an economy flinching. Auto loans crept from 7.1% lend 7.6%, adding $1,140 over the life of a standard 5-year loan. Dealers saw a 9% drop in weekend foot traffic, the steepest decline since the 2022 inflation scare. And Remember the Missouri town that needed $52 million to upgrade water plants? They weren't alone. A county in North Carolina saw its school construction bonds jump from 3.22%, lend 4.19%, costing families $5.8 million in added interest. A hospital network in Arizona shelved a $280 million expansion because financing costs ballooned by $29 million over the project's lifespan. A public transportation plan in Oregon lost $41 million in expected federal matching funds because budget assumptions no longer fit the revised borrowing environment. These are the hidden fractures of governance, improvisation. They don't grab headlines, but they carve into everyday life quietly, relentlessly. Now let's address the fundamental economic illusion behind Trump's maneuver, that executive speed is good for the economy. Speed is only good when you are moving in the right legal direction. When you cut through restraints that were designed to maintain stability, you don't get efficiency. You get what I call institutional whiplash. Institutional whiplash is the sudden slowdown caused by fear, not fundamentals. And after this ruling, whiplash hit every corridor of government. The Department of Energy paused 71 pending permits for a legal review cycle. The Department of Commerce issued a cautionary review memorandum to 22 trade offices, instructing them to reassess the durability of executive directives. The Office of Management and Budget quietly reclassified $96 billion worth of upcoming programs as legally exposed. In just 1 week, even within the private sector, the anxiety spread through internal communications. At Harbor West Bank, a regional lender, the credit committee raised the minimum approval threshold for commercial loans from 680 leaders and 720. The bank's chief risk officer wrote in an internal memo, "The court ruling did not create risk. The executive overreach that triggered it did." But perhaps the most striking fictional example comes from ordinary life. A young couple in Florida, Daniel and Marissa Lopez, were approved for a home loan at 6.32%. Hours before signing, the rate changed to 6.94%. Their monthly payment increased by $189, forcing them to cancel the contract. Marissa said, "We lost the house because the government can't follow its own rules." That is the price of governance chaos. Not red, not blue, just expensive. And this is the part people misunderstand most. Courts blocking a president is not instability. Courts having to block a president is instability. When Trump forces the system into collision with itself, the economy doesn't see a strong leader, it sees a reckless one. And investors, both foreign and domestic, react exactly the way they always do. They step back, they increase cash reserves, they reduce risk exposure, they raise borrowing costs, they delay projects, they wait for sanity, because markets can price bad news. But they cannot price a president who treats legality as optional and consequences as someone else's burden. If you strip the flags off the podium and look at this like an investor, you end up with a very simple question. Would you keep your capital in a company where the CEO routinely pushes illegal strategies, forces the board to intervene, ignores the legal department, and then tells shareholders it's all part of the plan? Because right now, that's how the United States looks to anyone holding its debt, its equities, or its currency. The blocked executive maneuver was not an isolated event. It was the latest entry in a pattern. Trade threats that never went through proper review, immigration orders written overnight and thrown out by judges, energy rules flipped like a light switch, and now an improvised tariff dividend that the courts described as a misuse of emergency authority. In corporate terms, this is not vision, it's governance failure. And governance failure has a price.
Inside one of the largest public pension funds in the Midwest, a $92 billion system serving teachers and state workers, the chief investment officer ran a new stress test after the ruling.
In their central scenario, if this style of improvisational leadership continues for another 4 years, expected long-term returns fall from 6.4% to 5.1%. That 1.3 percentage point gap may sound modest, it isn't. Over 20 years, it means the fund ends up roughly $27 billion short of its obligations. The difference has to be filled by higher contributions, lower benefits, or more borrowing. That's what it looks like when trust decay is converted into numbers. In a quieter corner of the economy, At a family-owned trucking firm in Indiana with 120 employees, the owner did her own calculation. Higher financing costs on her fleet renewals, plus weaker freight demand from delayed construction projects, cut her profit margin from 8.2% to 4.9%. She had planned to increase retirement contributions for her drivers by 1% of salary. After the Fed froze its cuts and banks tightened, that plan went into the drawer. Her comment to a local reporter summed it up. "I don't need a president who fights for me on TV. I need one who doesn't make my numbers worse every time a judge reads the fine print." This is what people miss when they treat Trump's behavior as just political drama. Drama has characters and applause. Governance has compounding. When you undermine process, when you attack courts, when you treat institutional limits as personal insults, the damage doesn't show up in a single crash. It accumulates in 1,000 small disappointments. Projects delayed, wages frozen, pensions underfunded, opportunities never pursued. Abroad, the perception shift is even more blunt. At an internal strategy meeting at a major sovereign wealth fund in Asia, a slide labeled United States 2030. Outlook listed 3 bullet points under risk. 1. Elevated legal political volatility. 2. Declining policy horizon visibility. 3. Executive branch unpredictability. The proposed response was simple. Reduce planned U.S. equity exposure by 15% over 5 years and reallocate $40 billion toward jurisdictions with stronger procedural reliability. No speeches, no protests, no noise, just capital quietly voting against chaos. And this is the key insight. Capital is always voting. You may not hear it, but you live with its verdict. Higher mortgage rates, tighter credit, fewer job offers, slower wage growth. Those are just the subtitles of capital's real-time vote on a country's behavior. Now, ask yourself what it means when foreign pension funds, central banks, and insurance companies start applying a governance discount to the United States. It means the cost of being American creeps higher while the benefit of being American grows slower. That's not ideology. That's arithmetic. From my vantage point, Trump's approach to power looks exactly like what I warn investors to avoid in CEOs. A fixation on headlines, a disregard for rules, and a willingness to burn long-term trust for short-term applause. In a company, that kind of leadership eventually forces a reckoning. The auditors step in, the board tightens, controls, the stock re-rates downward, and the cost of capital rises. The court's block and the Fed's hesitation are the institutional equivalent of that reckoning. So what do you do as an individual in this environment? First, you stop pretending you're a spectator. When a president gambles with legality, you are the collateral. Your mortgage, your 401, your town school bonds, your employer's expansion plans, they are all chips on the table whether you like it or not. Second, you treat political leaders the same way you would treat the CEO of a company you own. You don't ask whether they entertain you. You ask whether they respect process, listen to competent advisors, and operate inside the law without daring the system to stop them. If the answer is no, the risk they introduce into your financial life is larger than any tax policy they promise. Third, in your portfolio, you bias yourself toward resilience. Strong balance sheets, low leverage, essential products, diversified revenue streams, and minimal dependence on rapid regulatory favors. You assume that executive overreach will create more legal collisions, more policy whiplash, and more market hiccups. You hold extra liquidity so that when volatility misprices high-quality businesses, you can buy what others are forced to sell. But there's a broader responsibility here beyond individual positioning. A democracy at its core is a system for keeping the cost of capital low by making power predictable. Courts, legislatures, independent agencies, they're not decorations. They are mechanisms that reassure creditors and investors that no one person can hijack the system on a whim. When citizens reward leaders for attacking these mechanisms, they are voting, knowingly or not, for higher interest rates, lower growth, and thinner safety nets. I've always believed that the greatest asset of the American economy is not its companies or its land or even its people. It is the credibility of its promises. When a bond says full faith and credit of the United States, Markets have historically treated that as the closest thing to risk-free that exists. But full faith in credit has two words in front of credit that many people ignore: full faith. Credit pricing is just faith turned into a number. Every time Trump pushes an unlawful scheme and forces the courts to intervene, that faith is chipped away. 1 basis point here, 5 basis points there, a slightly higher spread on municipal bonds, a slightly lower expected return on pensions, a quietly reduced allocation from a foreign fund. None of those things will topple America, but over years, they can erode its financial advantage. If you're serious about protecting your wealth, your retirement, your business, your children's opportunities, you cannot separate that goal from the question of how your country is governed. A president who treats institutions as obstacles and courts as enemies is not just a political problem. He is a line item in your future cash flow statement and not a positive one. In investing, you don't get paid for ignoring risk. You get paid for recognizing it early and acting rationally while others are still cheering. This moment, with a blocked executive maneuver, a spooked bond market, a hesitant Fed, and a global investor base quietly recalculating the price of American unpredictability, is exactly the kind of moment where rational people stop clapping and start counting. If you remember nothing else from this, remember this: trust compounds just like capital, and it can be destroyed far faster. A country that burns trust to feed one man's need for spectacle is a country that will pay more for everything it builds and borrow dearer for every future it tries to finance. As an investor, you can't control who sits in the Oval Office, but you can control how seriously you take the cost of their behavior. If you want your money to compound, you should want your institutions to be boring, your laws to be respected, and your presidents to know the difference between leadership and improvisation. When they don't be surprised when the market starts charging you for the privilege of living in the chaos they create.